Serra, Part 8. Unlike Mexico, at this point, at 61, he's having difficulty moving around. And he starts to use a mule to go back and forth among the different missions as Padre Presidente. It was very important for the Franciscans and their whole notion of their lives to make sure the communities they were establishing were Christian and kept a Christian identity. One of the negatives of this, at least to some of our modern sensitivities, would be how they handled runaways from the missions. That if somebody left the mission to try to go back to their native village, remember that they were not to be baptized unless they freely wanted it. It wasn't forced on them. So once they accepted this voluntary baptism, they became a member of that community. Now, the friars enforced a rather strict discipline, and so that if somebody ran away from the mission back to the native villages, the friars would set off with the soldiers and actually literally drag them back to the compound. So this has been sometimes unfavorably reported as something very negative about the missions, and yet it was a reality. They felt, the friars did, from their spiritual point of view, they were saving them from any of the occasions of sin if they would go back to their old ways. So it's a little part of the issue that we have to keep reminding ourselves that when we deal with these missions and the colonial government of Spain, it's not a clear story of good and bad. There's a little bit mixed into each of them. And maybe it's also important to keep in mind that sometimes things did become violent. For example, in San Diego, there was they moved the mission a little further away from the presidio because of water needs of the group, and something happened there. They lost some you might say horses, and they were upset. The soldiers got very upset with the natives, and they went after the natives to capture them, and the natives' uprising against them was so severe, they came and burned down the mission. And they actually, the head friar there, his name was Luis Jaime, and he was a young 35-year-old from Mallorca, another Mallorcan Junipero Serra. Remember, Junipero Serra is also a Mallorcan. And so he was killed, and Padre Serra saw him as a martyr for the faith. But the military governor, Mancado, was not very happy, and he wanted to go after and make a big, you might say, a big example of this by punishing everybody. And it's interesting, Junipero Serra said, "Don't do that." They had some people they had captured, and Junipero Serra said, "Don't do that." And it's interesting. I'd like to read to you from the notes. Of course, it was from Francisco Paulo, Padre Paulo. He writes something that he wrote down. So in this case, Junipero appealed to Bucareli, who's the viceroy of Mexico again. "As to the murderer, let him live, in order that he should be saved, which is the very purpose of our coming here. Give him to understand, after a moderate amount of punishment, that he is being pardoned in accordance with our law, which commands us to forgive injuries, and let us prepare him not for death, but for eternal life." What an outstanding statement. I mean, in terms of the kind of cruelty and world that Padre Serra lived in, this expression almost, you might say, is almost against capital punishment. It's not a generalization, so I'm not going to say he's against capital punishment totally, but it's an interesting case that he brings up. He says, our purpose of our religion and our purpose being here is a spiritual purpose. So punish him, and let him go so that he might live out his life and not face death, but come to eternal life. So it's a very interesting incident that takes place after this little uprising and the killing of one of the friars themselves in the mission.